take it away.
Okay, before I do, the Islander merch is going out of stock very, very soon. So if you'd like any, head over to shop.lotuseaters.com. And on that note, my Common Sense Crusade pipe, it really is limited edition. I posted it out myself, and I'm leaving the country this weekend. So if you want one, you've got to get one by tomorrow, which is the last time I go to the post office. And I understand there's less than a handful remaining on the site, so you might not even have an opportunity. But if you do, go ahead and check it out now. shop.lotuseaters.com. Now, Churchill. Winston Churchill is clearly the greatest British hero of all time. And I want to get into why. He is the British Bulldog. His name is all over social media this week for reasons pertaining to Tucker Carlson, who had an interview that a lot of people disliked, but I think his interviews are important because he'll interview anybody. And that's how journalism used to be. You don't have to agree with the people you're interviewing. Yes, he does just sit there and nod through quite a lot of it, but I'm not here to critique his interviewing style. I think it's important that we're able to have a conversation, otherwise we enter the realm of censorship and mainstream media. So his independent journalism is great. However, someone he interviewed recently stepped on the path of maybe Hitler was misunderstood. Maybe we didn't win World War II, and maybe Churchill was the bad guy all along. I think some people will say that's quite a dangerous path to go down. I think it's a mistaken path to go down, because when we destroy our heroes, what do we have left but the villains? And so I'd like to go into why Winston Churchill is an imperfect and flawed national hero, if not a global hero.
If I can add something to begin with, I have not watched the full interview. The interview that Tucker Carlson conducted was with a historian called Darryl Cooper, I believe his surname is, who goes under the handle of Martyr Made. He has a podcast which is very popular where he speaks about history. For instance, he's spoken at length about the Israel-Palestine conflict. I think that's his most popular series. It's something ridiculous like a 26-hour long history, so it's almost like a novel length if you were to listen to an audiobook. The clips that I have seen of it does not appear that Darryl is trying to lean into Hitler apologia, especially regarding the Eastern Front, which I've seen a lot of people acting as though he was saying that nothing bad ever happened over there. The clips that I have seen seem to have been Darryl saying that a lot of the hardships that went on over there, a lot of the suffering that went on, was as a result of a lack of forward planning and resources allocated to that area of the European conflict. And he has not been saying that immediately means that there is no culpability to Hitler or any of the other German command. And people have had this reaction, which I think has been absolutely hysterical, of trying to point to him and say that he was apologizing for the Holocaust, that he was saying Hitler never did anything wrong. Yeah. Whereas for me, it seems that he's just trying to portray a slightly more, I wouldn't even say nuanced, I would say full historical take of the Second World War. Now, when it comes to things like saying that Churchill was an outright villain, he, believe, has said that that's basically just hyperbole on his own side, because to get such takes listened to in the first place, and probably to be able to speak to somebody like Tucker Carlson, you do need to engage in a bit of the old rhetoric so that you can have your voice amplified and heard. But I do think that the reaction from many conservatives in the centre-right has been massively overblown and very disingenuous in how it's been portraying what Darryl was saying.
So Darryl
was not trying to say to Tucker, listen, Hitler was the good guy. That is not what he was saying at all.
The conversation isn't the conversation. The conversation that started on Tucker has evolved into something else, which it always does. The centre-right has reacted to it in a way that I'm probably going to do and say, no, he was clearly a hero. And I think the far-right have reacted in a way that they're saying, well, Churchill lost us Europe, and he was the downfall of what we know and love. So I think
I was going to say that.
Really,
and I don't think it's quite so simple.
There is always
either
nuance
of those.
to these things.
As either of those, because I think that since the Second World War, especially since the time of large Hollywood films, it has been turned into a Disney Marvel cartoon narrative that people are really afraid to try to even look into it, because this is not something...
I wouldn't agree with that. I would say since Brexit, we've had doubling down on Churchill, the true Churchill, and how he was actually
racist,
and how he actually killed a million Indians.
Yeah, of course, there's all of that.
It's flipped around.
Well, I do think that people ignore that the conflict happened within a broader geopolitical context, where it wasn't just as simple as Hitler was a bad guy who wanted to kill Jews, and we went into Europe to save all of them. There was a lot of behind-the-scenes political maneuvering going on, particularly, and I think that this is one of Churchill's big mistakes, particularly with FDR, whose cabinet, whose administration was full of communist infiltrators who were working behind the scenes for the Soviet Union, who were able to deftly maneuver the situation to be able to leave at the end of World War II half of Europe, the Eastern Front, under Stalin's Soviet Union. So I think there is a discussion to be had there. I think is most often papered over, especially the fact again that there was a lot of communist infiltration into FDR, and FDR, when he entered the war after Pearl Harbor, really seems to have taken command of most of the effort on the Western Front.
Absolutely.
And to clarify what I said, I think that all of Europe lost in World War II. No one really won from what happened. And
Stalin won.
Well,
not in the end.
Well, not in the end, but
America
for his own
certainly
lifetime.
did.
Yeah, America.
America was the only country that really came out of it successful. And
which raises the question, did we really win? Of course, the answer is no, but that doesn't mean that the Nazis won, or that we should have lost to the Nazis.
Yeah, well, my position is that most of the leaders involved, FDR, Churchill, and Adolf, were all bad people.
Well,
but we're cutting you off before you've got to.
No, it's fine. There's going to be some nuance to that. I do not believe Churchill was a bad person. I do think categorically Hitler was a bad person. I do think there is nuance in between, but there's also on the extremities, and I think Hitler was on the extremity of that. But let's start with Churchill's background. So before World War II, obviously before World War I, there was the Boer War. And he was a kind of a military reporter. He was out there writing about events, but he got caught up in it. And he got caught in a prisoner of war camp, and he escaped through the swamps, through the mines, through the trenches, and kind of got out. So he had, before he'd even fought in a war, he'd had that kind of wartime experience that most people today would not have any kind of relation to. We wouldn't be able to relate to that kind of trauma. And so he was shaped by it before it began. So when World War I came up, he could have chosen to go, actually, I'm going to find a way out of this. But straight away, he's like, I want to jump in. And he was in the infantry, he was on the front lines, in the trenches, in World War I, in the hardships and dangers amongst everyone else. Bear in mind, this is someone who was born in Blenheim Castle. This is Palace. This is someone who is part of the establishment, part of the elite. Did not have to contribute in the way that he did, but chose to.
I wasn't aware of this. I thought he was just the First Lord of the Admiralty at the time.
In World War I?
In the First World War, yes.
No, he went to the front lines. Yeah, he went to the Western Front.
Oh, in what capacity? Was he a soldier?
He was, I believe he was infantryman, wasn't he?
Again, I thought he was already part of the cabinet government and was First Lord of the Admiral.
He did fight his way up in the 20s, but I think prior to that he was out there himself.
Well, I certainly respect him getting stuck in.
Was it? Okay.
Yes, because by the time of the First World War, he was already First Lord of the Admiralty, and one of the things that led to Germany's ultimate defeat was that there was a starvation blockade across the North Sea, preventing them from getting food and rations. Yeah. And that was initiated, I think, either in 1914 or 1915 by Churchill.
Right, I might be crossing my lines there, so I'll accept that correction. So let's start off with BBC's perspective on who Churchill was, because if you want a neutral perspective, you head to the BBC, don't you? Why was Churchill important? So before World War II started in 1939, Hitler was one of the few people Churchill was one of the few people warning about Hitler and the rise of the Nazis in Germany. Why is this important? Well, because most of our establishment, most of our politicians at the time were talking of peace, 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 and the language of appeasement. But the controversial side of this argument from the BBC is that, here we go, it was believed that Churchill believed that some races and some countries were naturally superior to others. This is today seen as anathema, but up until very recently was kind of seen as common sense. But it's a conversation you're no longer allowed to have. Is it possible that some countries are superior to others? Is it possible that some races are superior to others? In what regard? In what aspect? Well, I would say Kenyans are probably better at running than, say, for example, the Chinese. The Chinese are less smelly because they don't have that body odor instinct that the Indians have. There are different elements to different races that we are distinctive. But again, it's post-World War II and post-eugenics. It's a conversation we're no longer allowed to have for good reason. Do you want to zap that?
There's the fly. We found it. There's the fly. It's right there. It's right above Calvin. Go on. Oh,
We were so close.
Feeble.
I was quick as I could be.
Well, what you're saying there, though, to carry on that point that you're making, well, this was during the time of empire, and in the 1930s, prior to the dissolution of it, this was very close to the height of empire in terms of the actual sheer amount of land that we were in control of, the nations that we were in control of. So I think if you're living in that situation, especially if you're a member of the government or certainly a member of the media as he was during his wilderness years when he was a journalist, it's perfectly understandable for you to go, well, listen, we've colonized more of the world than anybody else has ever been able to.
Yep.
We control most of the world and we do a damn fine job at doing it. So I think it's understandable why in that situation you would go, yeah, maybe we're better than most other people, at least at doing this.
Which links into what he said in 1937 when he said he admits, for instance, that a great wrong was done to the Red Indians of America and the black people of Australia, but he doesn't admit that a wrong has been done to these people by the fact that a stronger race, a higher grade race, or more worldly wise race, to put it that way, has come in and taken their place, which actually speaks of the very popular meme that goes around that says, we should not apologize for being stronger, or we shouldn't apologize for you guys being so weak that you were conquered by another empire.
Well, if the roles were reversed, we wouldn't be getting an apology, would we?
And also these days you don't learn about what it was that we came across, especially when we got to somewhere like Australia, where the Aboriginals, the way it's sensitive to modern ideas of how you should treat women. The Aboriginals, when we first got there, we were shocked by the way that they treated their women, for instance. They couldn't find a single woman of any of the Aboriginal tribes who wasn't absolutely covered in scars because their husbands or the men of the tribes were absolutely brutalizing them with the primitive axes that they had, because they would just, any infraction from the women, they would beat them, they would stab them. Awful, awful things. So yes, we get to a very, very primitive society like that, where they've not developed technology beyond maybe a Stone Age capacity. And we get there, we say, no, you don't do that. We're going to put civilization on this land.
Yep.
Of course, I think we have every right to say that we improved Australia with our presence.
Yes, and that's on a global scale. He was very against Indian self-rule as well, and history has proven him right in that when the British were invited into India, India was a successful country, a successful part of the empire, and now look at India post-Britain. It's dire. It's an absolute mess. And I think if you ask most Indian people today, I think they'd probably have preferred to remain under British rule. But
Great example is South Africa as well.
Well, which is what sparked the first war that he was involved in, that fight there. But the British Empire spread more good, including civilization, around the world. And it's another conversation that people aren't able to have today without painting people like Churchill as villains for wanting to spread charity, hospitals, schools, the Christian faith, the English language, roads, infrastructure, as well as just civility and etiquette and good manners. So I think overall, that was a good argument that he was making, but perhaps not in language that we would make in today, but that goes with the change of the times. Now, moving over to the British government's perspective of Churchill, which I find interesting that they actually have one up.
Yeah, I didn't know this existed, to be fair.
So their argument is that Gallipoli was a mistake, and he acknowledges that it was a mistake, but he learned from that mistake, and because he was heavily criticised for that error of that campaign, he resigned from his position in government, which is quite a rarity these days, but something that people used to do, and therefore travelled to the Western Front himself. And I think, oh, there we go. This kind of nobility is something that I would love to see in our politicians today. If you make a mistake, look, Tony Blair, the Iraq War, send him to Iraq. Go to the front line yourselves, mate. If you and your henchmen think it's a good idea. But of course, they wouldn't even resign, never mind go to the Western Front.
I'd like to see modern politicians resign and go to fight in Ukraine.
Yeah.
They're willing to send all of our weapons over
Boris
there.
Johnson, get over to the Ukraine.
Yeah, what are you doing, Boris? Get in the trenches.
I've seen him with his body armour on in the Ukraine, but I haven't seen him on the front lines. And so, British policy during World War II was to try everything, but to try it on a scale where...
I'm so sorry, it's so distracting. It's going away again. I think it's flying above our lights. Apologies, everybody.
World War II, we tried everything, but on a scale where we were able to fail. And I think that's a sign of great leadership in that, look at the campaigns, like the SOE that failed, Special Operations Executive. So set Europe ablaze, wasn't very successful. But Bletchley Park Bletchley Park was massively successful. So he had these little kind of units, and he said, give that a go, and whatever worked, we doubled down on.
Well, we didn't put all our eggs in one basket.
Exactly. But what didn't work, he was able to say, no, that's a failure. And I think, again, many modern politicians would say, well, they would double down on their own initiatives, whether they failed or not. And so that's a sign of a change in the style of politics that we've got today. My mouse is broken, by the way, Samson.
So's mine.
Churchill became synonymous with successful campaigns like Dunkirk, like the Battle of Britain. This is just chaos today. And the Blitz spirit. Just ignore it. Pretend it's not there.
Yeah.
Just imagine we're in India. His warnings against the appeasement of Nazi Germany were proven correct when the Second World War, of course, broke out. But he was warning about this, obviously in 1939, before the war broke out. So in 1940, he gets voted in because he's one of the few people that says this is wrong, Hitler's wrong, this is bad, and Chamberlain and everyone else are like, well, let's settle. Oh, thank you, got it
back. I got it. Oh,
so let's go to our.
There we go. I've got it. It should be working.
Excellent. There we go. So, of course, he was one of the greatest orators we've ever had, not just statesmen. So statesmen in terms of getting things done, making the country work. He managed to get the civil service to be efficient, which, again, is something I think we're lacking from modern politicians. He had this sense of urgency. Telephone switchboards quadrupled their efficiency. The chief of staff and the joint planning staff were in almost constant sessions. Like, he managed to change what didn't work under Chamberlain, where everyone just thought, wartime's the same as peacetime, and managed to make an attitude that I think only Boris Johnson could accomplish in modern terms, of getting everyone to realize that there is a national state of emergency. And so he did not permit an attitude of defeatism, and nor would he entertain talk of reasonable terms with Adolf Hitler. But his famous speech, or one of his most famous speeches, in 1940 was, "We shall go to the end. We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and the oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender." Going back to an age of Britain never ever shall be slaves, going back to Royal Britannia, going back to people actually believing in patriotism. We shall defend our island. That one part of that sentence I would love to see any of our politicians saying publicly these days when we're being invaded every single day. Did you guys cover Callum Smiles, by the way?
Oh, him stopping the migrant boat. No, we haven't actually. I was waiting until there were some more examples, and I was going to put it into one big segment.
It was not to go off on a tangent, but I just think it's fantastic that he's gone out there in France and pointed out the smugglers and said, look, stop them. And the police have actually managed to stop them. I think it shows that if there is the will to do it, it can be done. And our politicians clearly don't have the political will. And we've frozen again, by the way, Samson. Sorry about this.
I have a fiddle with the thing here.
Thank you.
I will say, I do think that Chamberlain is somewhat unfairly maligned for the Munich decision. Would you like?
Really?
Would you like some context regarding that? Well, if there's an excellent, wonderful compilation of essays edited by a man called Harry Elmer Barnes called "Perpetual War for Perpetual Peace," which looks more at the American side of the foreign policy during FDR's time, and in that is an essay by Frederick R. Sanborn called Roosevelt is Frustrated in Europe, which discusses how around the time of the Munich conference, around late September 1938, leading up to the Munich conference and the Czechoslovakia crisis as it was going on, in fact, Britain and France had built up enough armaments, or at least had enough available to them at the time, that they were thinking about, in fact planning on, potentially attacking Germany over the Czechoslovakian crisis. And Germany itself, the public were devoid of enthusiasm for any sort of conflict that was likely to spring up because of all of this. Yeah. And the general staff as well, all of Hitler's generals, were not happy with it and were in fact planning a putsch against Hitler at the time. And it was the intervention of Franklin Roosevelt coming to the Allies' side and saying, well, we can work all of this out, we can get a peace deal with them, that led to them actually coming to the table. Now, we know from a lot of reports and private communications and letters that we have access to now that Roosevelt, even by the late 1930s, was basically itching to enter into a European conflict. He made the promise when he was doing his 1940 campaign to his re-election that he wouldn't involve himself in any conflict that happened in Europe, but he was actually planning behind the scenes on doing so anyway. And it seems from the reports that I've read and these essays here, the history that I've read, that Roosevelt was essentially trying to maneuver a better situation later on so that America would be better prepared to enter into a war, because by 1938 they were beginning to try to get armaments ready, but they weren't quite prepared in the same way that they were by, say, 1941. Because Roosevelt, through Lend-Lease, for instance, really put Britain under his own thumb. And if you read Stalin's War by Sean McMeekin, which is a remarkable book, which is shockingly available in places like Waterstones, it's published by Penguin, it seems very, very clear that Roosevelt had in his own aims a breaking up of British power. He saw America as a new and emerging empire.
It seems to have worked.
Yes, and thought that by maneuvering England and Britain into a situation where it couldn't defend itself and would have to rely on American aid, as we did with Lend-Lease, that he would be able to extend American power across Europe. Contend as well with, as I mentioned, there were communist infiltrators in his administration. When you look at how they treated Britain, where we had Lend-Lease, versus how they treated Russia after 1941 Operation Barbarossa, we got Lend-Lease, they got unconditional aid. Anything that they wanted with no obligation to pay it back. Which ended up, of course, blowing up in their face afterwards, because then you descend the Iron Curtain and the Cold War begins. So I just wanted to clear up some historical context.
Well, it's interesting to hear that FDR was working on that preparatory stuff, because this is what I understand Churchill was doing as well. Before he got into office, he was, with his strategic foresight, he was kind of thoroughly preparing for Britain's fleets for war, and monitoring Germans' progress, their strength, their manoeuvres, and figuring out a scheme, a plan, which I think is what both sides should have been doing. Well, I mean, England and America should have been doing.
So as we've got a technical problem and we can't use the mouse anymore, I've not been able to fix it.
It's all right. Okay, we can go ahead without any special links. Okay. So as you were alluding to, that special relationship was between the UK and the US was started in that period. It was certainly FDR massively, and also Churchill.
So, some like Carroll Quigley would contend that it began earlier than that with Cecil Rhodes, but I've not actually read his work, and I know it's quite controversial and contentious. So I'm not going to carry on with that.
Sorry? Wasn't Cecil Rhodes in South Africa?
Yes, but he was also involved with, Milner's kindergartners, I think is what it's Milner's kindergarten, Alfred Milner, who had ideas for basically an Anglo-American world system. But I can't really go in.
I mean, I'm sure many people had the idea, but I think between that period, Churchill and FDR were certainly two of the biggest enhancers of that idea, and fostered that relationship. And of course, the Iron Curtain speech really helped with that. But I think that's probably an area that was seen as an advantage at the time, but has turned out to be detrimental, in that we gave up a lot of what we had, our military might or soft powers, and America was encouraged and strengthened by...
Well, I think it ended up being much more beneficial to America than it did to us in the long term.
I think as a nation, Britain lost more than anyone. Even Germany gained more out of World War II, with the Americans investing a lot of money in.
Well, America gained from Germany as well, given NASA Operation Paperclip.
Yeah. So the point being that Churchill, of course, was not perfect. He was a flawed human being like the rest of us. And previous to this, he was a eugenicist. I think many were at the time, but the whole point of, coming out of World War II was it changed that conversation for good.
In the early 20th century, there was a department of eugenics in the UK.
Yeah. And I don't think we could ever go back there now because of World War II. So it's a thankful consequence. But he was also the man whose failure to act during the Bengal famine in 1943 ended up in 1 million Indians dying. And so, of course, you have some gripes with him yourself.
I have a personal gripe, yeah. So my grandfather was on the HMS Repulse, and in 1941, in December of 1941, I think it was Zero Squadron or something like that, was sent out towards the sort of east to fight against the Japanese, and off of the coast of Singapore on the 10th of December 1941, the HMS Repulse and the HMS Prince of Wales were set upon by the Japanese Air Force and Navy. And of course, these were two, boats. One, I think, was a destroyer against a large section of Japanese military might. And Churchill's intention was to send, basically a small squadron to set up a defence of the East and our assets in the East. And, Singapore, of course, was under the control of Britain. It wasn't known as Singapore at the time. But yes, and it just wasn't a very good strategy. There was the sinking of the HMS Hood in, I think it was in the Straits of Denmark, which illustrated that these large ships can be sunk. And so there was precedent set that these sorts of things can happen no matter how good our ships are. And sending two of them out without any air support, and that's the key thing here, is that the Japanese planes were able to do bombing runs and things like that upon the ships, as well as there being naval attacks as well. And even though the Repulse was able to dodge 19 missiles before getting hit by 4 or 5 simultaneously, which you can't dodge, that it was obvious that no matter what happened to the people on those ships, they were doomed. And they were doomed because they were sent out there with insufficient support. It was stupid to think that the Japanese were just going to allow them to go about the ocean, because of course they had the might to sink them, and they did. And luckily my grandfather survived, but 500 of his other crewmen died. Also, because the sinking was obviously a very brutal thing, he breathed in lots of engine oil, which gave him health problems for the rest of his life. Not to mention the fact he never talked about it, because he saw many people he knew well were his friends die. And that happened because of Churchill. And there's no denying that it was his call, because he was the one that pushed to do this. It was foolish. There were lessons already learnt from the war that could have been done differently. And, had things gone slightly different that day, my grandfather died, well, obviously I wouldn't be here. So I came that close to not existing thanks to Winston Churchill. So I have my personal gripes with him.
Oh, that's fair enough.
I think there are many other examples throughout the war where Churchill ordered something that was pig-headed and didn't have enough regard for the cost on the people that he was sending out to do so.
I think anyone that's going to stick their head above the parapet to the point of leading a war campaign is going to make mistakes, and it's unfortunate because lives are always at stake. But it's part of the policy, part of being a leader, isn't it? Part of being a politician, unfortunately.
You've got to deal with those sorts of things, but I think there's also a responsibility to be better than he was.
Fair enough. I don't want to spend too much time on Hitler because this is a segment on Churchill, but I just want to put a reminder out there that Hitler was not misunderstood. The reason we went into World War II was because there was an invasion of Poland. It wasn't the other way around. It seems to be online in certain far-right circles at the moment that people are suggesting that that Churchill caused World War II and because he was a warmonger. But the reason we entered was because Poland had already been invaded with a formal declaration of war. Before a formal declaration of war during the period of 1st of September to the 25th of October 1939. So during that occupation of Poland, 16,000 Polish people were murdered, and that's just in that first year. There were another 20,000, I believe, in the following year, and of course thousands more after that. But at the same time, in 1939, Italy, another Axis power, obviously invaded Albania. Prior to that, they'd already invaded the Horn of Africa and later Yugoslavia and Greece. So there were very little resistance to the Axis powers. And I think Winston Churchill is one of the few that were bold enough to say, no, we as Britain can put a stop to this. And what began in Germany with the ghettos and the concentration camps did end with the final solution. And I think we've reached a point online now where we don't even all agree that the Holocaust happened, the genocide of the European Jews and the Romani Gypsies, when we have so many first-hand, well, not so many first-hand anymore, but lots of second-hand witnesses of the atrocities. And not to mention the Japanese war crimes and their attack on the US, which ultimately dragged America into World War II as well. It's just to say, really, that Churchill was in the right time at the right place. He was needed. I think he probably went on to do a bit of a Joe Biden in his second term in 51 to 55, probably shouldn't have been Prime Minister again. He was too old and frail and making too many mistakes by then. Should have probably retired when he got ousted in 45. But he still went on to voted as Britain's greatest hero of all time in a BBC poll. And I found this lovely little anecdote to end on with one of the greatest actors of all time.
Of course, I was immensely
one of the greatest politicians of all time.
impressed with Churchill, but he was quite another thing, you know. He had great humor and great irony. He went to see me when I played Othello on the stage in London, and I heard a low murmuring in the front row. I thought he was talking to himself, and then he came backstage afterwards and sat down in the dressing room and said, "Most potent, grave, and reverend signors, my most approved good masters," and began the whole of Othello's part, which he had memorized, and including the cuts which I had made, which he read with a good deal of extra emphasis. Mm-hmm. And then a few years afterwards, I happened to be in Venice trying to get some money for a movie during the festival, and poor Churchill had been, right after the war, as you know, crest of the greatest victory that any single man had ever presided over in modern history, was voted out of office. Quite properly, probably, but it was a tragic blow for him. And there he was in the hotel at the Lido with Clemmy, his wife, alone. And he'd go swimming out on the beach. And one day at lunch, I came in with a Russian businessman I was trying to hustle for some money for this picture. And as we passed Mr. Churchill's table, Mr. Churchill saw me and made that little gesture, and the Russian went out of his mind. This is a white Russian, not a red Russian. This is a you know, a hustling, semi-Armenian Russian. And when he saw that Mr. Churchill not only knew me, but gave a rather special acknowledgement, it was clear to me that I had the money for my picture. So the next morning I was out swimming in the beach, and I found myself paddling in the water right next to Mr. Churchill. And I hadn't gone up to speak to him, but there we were in the water, and I had known him on and off during the war in a humble capacity, and I said, and he had come backstage to see me, and I said, "Mr. Churchill, I think you ought to know what you did for me." And I told him about how this acknowledgement had meant so much to me with my financier. And that day at lunch, I came in with the financier again, and Mr. Churchill rose from his chair and bowed.
That is good.
Pretty good, eh?
That's good. We'll be back after this message.
Rubbish interviewer, but I love that. Another time.
I think the most stunning part of that story for me was Orson Welles playing Othello. Wouldn't see that these days, would you?
No, you wouldn't. What another era that was.
I hope you appreciated that segment from the podcast of the Lotus Eaters, and if you want to see what else we're up to, you can follow Calvin's series. Here in this episode, he had Nick Tanconi, the interim leader of UKIP, and Speaker Bob from Speaker's Corner. And if you want to see everything else that we're putting out, you can also follow us on our Twitter account, where we always post links to it. Thank you very much, and goodbye.